Leave a comment where you are listening in the world. Please subscribe if you enjoy our content. Enjoy! I use a dating site to hopefully find a decent person to go out with and try to make connections. This dating site sadly has a lot of duds and very few decent folk available on there. However, I remained optimistic and kept going back to check messages and things. I received a message from a normal-looking guy who seemed to have a lot of good things going for him. After a bit of talking, I felt really comfortable giving him my personal phone number, something I rarely ever do. We talked on the phone and found we had many things in common. Both of us were nerdy and had some form of collection of nerdy things. At that point, I really wanted to meet him in person, so we set up a day to go out for some brunch at a local place. He told me he was excited to meet me, and I told him that I was excited too. On the day of the date, we had our lovely brunch and talked about various things. He was an extremely tall guy and built like an ox. It was almost a little intimidating, but I do like me some tall guys, so that didn't bother me much. After some time talking, he got a text from his mom asking him where he was at and that she needed him to come help her with his dad. He told me after the conversation with his mom that his dad was not doing well and was basically in hospice care at home. I gave my condolences and said it was fine to cut the date off short so he could go take care of his dad. I even told him I'd like to see him again sometime soon when he was able to, which he felt the same about. As we left the restaurant and I headed for my car, we ended up stopping for a short time and conversed just a little longer, but then, all of a sudden he asked me if I wanted to feel him. I was taken aback by what he said and asked him what he meant. It was so out of nowhere that I didn't think he meant his groin. I looked around nervously from the parking lot, looking to see if there was anyone nearby that I could flag down for help. Sadly, there was no one, and so my attention turned back to him, afraid of what he might do, and him waiting there expectantly for me to touch him. I shakily reached my hand and tried to aim not directly upon his crotch. Then I announced, "Oh yeah, ahaha, sure can feel it." I laughed nervously and lied, but then he forcefully grabbed my hand and brought it to his groin. Thankfully, I still didn't feel it, as I still kind of aimed offset. He asked me if I felt it now, and I lied once again and said yeah, I felt it. I was so afraid, and was at a loss for words. He towered over me like a skyscraper. If he wanted to, he could have easily lifted me up, put a hand over my mouth, and shoved me into his car without breaking a sweat. To cut the awkward silence, I said, "Well, I better go now." He said goodbye and left to go to his car, and I torpedoed into my own car and locked the door as soon as I sat on the seat. My hands shook as I gripped the steering wheel and headed home, glancing into my rear mirror to make sure he had not followed me. When I got home, I washed my hands thoroughly, even though I didn't actually touch him. Just the thought of it made me sick, and washing my hands made me feel at least slightly better than before. After that day, I never texted him back or answered his phone call. Now, here's where things got more scary. So, I knew what his name was, and he had mentioned what his dad's name was, but on my own I discovered what his middle and last name happened to be. I then used his full name to look up any sort of criminal report or any information I could obtain about him. I needed to know everything, especially if he was a criminal. The first thing I saw with his full name was an article about a woman whose body was found on the side of the highway in a sleeping bag or a black bag. As I read the article, I noticed certain names being used. First off, his name. It matched. Then later in the article, after reading about what he had done to the woman, they had a portion where the journalist spoke with his parents. Then his dad's nickname came up, the same name he told me his dad's was. To seal the deal that this was the same guy, was that the dates and his age matched up. He went to prison for only 10 or less years. When he got on the dating site and talked to me, he must have just gotten out of prison about a month before. It all hit me like a ton of bricks at once. I just went on a date with a man who killed a woman, and he never told me. Had I known beforehand, I never, ever, would have gone out on a date with him. I would have never given him my personal number. Since then, I've hoped he hadn't searched for my address. Suffice to say, I rested uneasy for months since discovering his crime. I got sick of trying to meet guys at bars, so I let a couple of my dumbass friends talk me into trying OkCupid. Ugh. This guy started messaging me. He seemed cute enough. Told me he had tattoos, which I'm not really into, but I thought I could make an exception. Asked me if I was 420 friendly, and I said yeah. He gave me his phone number, so I texted him. Within 5 minutes, I pretty much hated him. He was just annoying. Poor spelling and grammar are a huge turnoff for me. So is sending me 5 texts in 60 seconds, asking me questions faster than I can answer them. But he somehow convinced me to hang out with him. We agreed that I'd come to his house after I got off work, and we could just smoke and watch TV. I don't have a GPS or a smartphone, but I'm not a directionless idiot, especially in a town that I practically grew up in. I thought to myself that I probably should have stopped for gas, but then decided I'd be fine. I ended up having to call this guy for clarification on the shitty, incorrect directions he gave me like 5 times. I mean, seriously, how does this guy even find his own house? He couldn't even explain to me how the fuck to get there. He also failed to mention it was up some windy-ass back road. Also, just the sound of his voice was not pleasing at all. The more I spoke to him on the phone, the less I looked forward to meeting him. It was raining, I was driving slowly because I was lost, and some assfuck in a Mustang was riding my ass and blaring his horn, so I decided to pull over. The only place which I could really do so in such short notice was a random driveway. I put my car in park, called the guy again, and was like, seriously, this is ridiculous. I don't know where I am, and I don't see any of the landmarks you are talking about. I described a few of the houses nearby, and he somehow magically knew what he was talking about all of a sudden. He tried once again to direct me there, and I said, okay, but if I get lost again, I'm just going home. I'm too low on gas to just randomly be driving around this holler. I went to back out of the driveway, and hey, guess what? I was too low on gas, and the fucking thing died and wouldn't start back up. Ugh. I haven't even met this guy yet, and I just want to go the fuck home already. So I called him again, and he starts to cop a fucking attitude with me like, oh my god, you can't seriously be lost again? I told him I was out of gas, and he needed to come help me. He grabbed his gas can, and picked me up in his fucking Dutchamobile. Some little Honda CRX thing with the, I don't know, muffler that's too loud on purpose, because some of you dudes think that shit is cool for some reason. Sounded like we were driving a Bumblebee. And he looked nothing like his pictures. He was about 70 pounds heavier than his pictures led me to believe. He had a fucking labret piercing, with a huge goddamn hoop, just weighing his bottom lip down, looked like a droopy fucking moron. Sideways fox racing hat. And his tattoos were all fucking trashy cliches, with the ink halfway faded out. This guy is the embodiment of everything I do not want in a boyfriend. Before we left my car in the driveway to go fill up the gas can, I wrote a note to the homeowners. Said something along the lines of, hello, my name is blah blah blah. My phone number is 000-000-0000. The time is 11:35 p.m. I am so sorry, but I got lost in this neighborhood, used your driveway to turn around, but ran out of gas. My friend took me to the store to get some gas, and I will be back to move my car ASAP. Please don't tow me, and call me if you have any questions. I just stuck it in the door frame and left it there. Old dude brings me back to my car, we fill up my tank, and I see that the note is still there. I took it out thinking, sweet, these people never have to know I was here. And the guy explains to me one more time how to get to his fucking house, then just drives off like, and it's like nearly midnight at this point, doesn't even wait up for me to make sure I actually get there. That somehow didn't wake up the homeowner, but when I got in my car and started it back up, went to back out of their driveway. This 65-year-old man, topless, in sweatpants, looks kinda like Clint Eastwood, bursts out of his house waving a fucking pistol in the air, screaming, "Who the fuck are you and what are you doing?" I see the gun and freak out. But to provide a little context, this was in West Virginia, so most older homeowners have guns. I just took my hands off the steering wheel and held them up in the air like, as if to say, I don't have anything. I'm sorry. He yells at me to get out of the car. I stepped out, and once he saw I was a tiny little girl, he put the gun away and was like, Jesus, what are you doing here? Honestly, this old dude was ripped. He was actually a lot more attractive than the guy I was supposed to be hanging out with. I joked to myself for a moment like, maybe I should ask what he's up to right now. Ha! Anyway, I showed him the note, gave him the short version, and he was like, well, alright, then go on now. I finally get to my douche date's house, and he just laughs. I was less amused, however. So then we smoked a couple bowls, watched some Trailer Park Boys. Turns out that a similar taste in TV shows, our affinity for the green were the only things we had in common. I was not attracted to him at all. I hung out for maybe 90 minutes, then told him I was going home. He asked me to text him to let him know I got home safe, fair enough. So I did. Then he tried to keep a conversation going the rest of the night. I wasn't responding. Eventually I said, dude, I am trying to sleep. I'll talk to you later. He texted me the next day, we talked a little bit, but I was working. By the time I got off work, I had 6 fucking messages from him, the last few of which he was getting pissy that I wasn't responding. I was like, dude, I have a job. Sometimes I have to do stuff other than text you all day. Alright, this type of shit went on for about 4 more days. He kept insisting to know when he could see me again, and I legitimately had a full work schedule ahead of me, and he didn't like that response. He acted mopey and clingy when I told him I'd just let him know when I was available to hang again. Then he thought that maybe we'd just sit around and fucking chat all day. He'd get pissy when I didn't respond to him within 10 minutes. It got to the point that I just went off, no filter, not worried about his precious little ego at all. I told him to leave me the fuck alone. And he was like, fine. And that was pretty much that. He texted me again like a week later. I didn't respond, never heard from him again. I went on a couple other dates with guys I met on OkCupid. Nothing quite that disastrous ever went down again, but within 2 or so months, I deleted that fucking profile. Online dating is the worst. It's just like real life. Only fat asses and men old enough to be my father want to get with me, and anyone that I find interesting or attractive just ignores me. Fuck that shit. I'll get 9 more cats before I ever make another dating site profile. I should have trusted my gut the moment I noticed the tan line on his ring finger. But no, I told myself to give him the benefit of the doubt. Maybe he just forgot to take it off while tanning, I thought. Maybe he's divorced. Maybe I'm overthinking. Spoiler alert, I wasn't. That tiny, innocent tan line was just the beginning of a night that spiraled into something out of a psychological thriller. We met at this trendy bar downtown. The kind of place that's all dim lighting, exposed brick, and overpriced cocktails. He walked in, sharp suit, confident stride, and a smile that was just a little too perfect. He seemed polished enough to sandpaper over the warning bells in my head. When he sat down, his cologne was just subtle enough to seem tasteful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he'd drowned in it on purpose, like he was trying to cover something up. I just didn't know it yet. So, what do you do? I asked casually, sipping my drink. I'm head of security at this big multi-million-dollar corporation, he said, leaning back with an air of practiced confidence. The words dripped out like he'd rehearsed them in the mirror 100 times. It's intense work, but someone's got to keep things safe, right? I nodded, trying to seem impressed, but something about the way he said it felt off. My friend's husband is actually head of security for a major firm, and I know how he talks about his job. The jargon, the pride, the details, it's like second nature to him. This guy, he was vague, almost too smooth, like he'd memorized a job description off LinkedIn and hoped I wouldn't ask questions. Still, I let it slide. Maybe he was just trying to sound impressive. Maybe I was being paranoid. But then came the next red flag. No kids, he said, smiling over his whiskey. Never been married either. Just haven't found the right person yet. I raised an eyebrow. Really? He laughed, leaning forward like he was sharing a secret. What? You don't believe me? I shrugged, playing it cool, but something about the way he said it felt rehearsed. Like he'd delivered that line before, probably to more people than just me. I wanted to believe him, but my gut wasn't buying it. And then when he went to pay the bartender, I saw it. His wallet slipped open just enough for me to catch a glimpse of the photo tucked inside. A family portrait. A woman, a little boy, and him. Smiling like they were the picture of happiness. My stomach dropped. My throat tightened. He came back, oblivious, flashing that same fake smile. So, what's your next drink? He asked, like nothing had happened. Like I hadn't just seen what I saw. I froze for a moment, then forced a smile. I'm good for now. My voice came out tight, barely audible over the pounding in my ears. My mind raced. Who was the woman in the picture? His sister? A friend? No. That tan line. That portrait. That lie about no kids. It was all starting to add up, and I didn't like where it was leading. But I wasn't done yet. I wasn't going to let him off that easily. So, I said, trying to sound casual, head of security, huh? My friend's husband does that too. What kind of stuff do you handle? He hesitated, just for a split second, but it was enough. His confident facade cracked, and for the briefest moment, I saw the wheels in his head spinning, scrambling for an answer. Oh, you know, he said, waving a hand like it was no big deal. Overseeing operations, managing a team, that kind of thing. That kind of thing? My friend's husband has told me about his job before, and trust me, it's not just that kind of thing. It's detailed, specific, and intense. And this guy couldn't even fake his way through a basic conversation about it. I smiled, pretending to be impressed. Inside, I was boiling. Why lie? Why weave this ridiculous web of nonsense when the truth was probably less complicated? And more importantly, why lie to me? The rest of the night was a blur of him rambling about his job, his single life, and how he was looking for someone real. I played along, nodding and smiling, but my mind was elsewhere. I kept replaying everything in my head, the tan line, the photo, the flimsy answers. It was like piecing together a puzzle where every piece screamed, "This guy's a fraud." Finally, I'd had enough. "Hey," I said, cutting him off mid-sentence. "I actually need to head out. Early morning tomorrow." He looked surprised but recovered quickly, flashing that too-perfect smile again. "Oh, of course. Let me walk you to your car." I didn't want him anywhere near my car, but I nodded, keeping the mask on. The walk to the parking lot was awkward, his small talk grating on my nerves like nails on a chalkboard. When we reached my car, he leaned in like he was expecting a goodnight kiss. I stepped back, my voice steady but firm. "Look, I don't think this is going to work." His smile faltered. "What? Why?" I paused, debating whether to call him out or just leave it at that. But I couldn't help myself. "You're married, aren't you?" His face went pale. For the first time all night, he was speechless. And that was all the confirmation I needed. I shook my head, disgusted. "Good luck with whatever this is," I said, getting into my car and locking the doors. As I drove away, I couldn't stop shaking. Not from fear, but from anger. How many other people had he lied to? How many other women had fallen for his fake charm and fake life? The thought made my skin crawl. When I got home, I told my friend everything. She was horrified, especially when I mentioned the head of security lie. "That's so creepy," she said. "Why would he even lie about something like that?" I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that I'd dodged a bullet, or maybe a whole firing squad. And even now, I can't help but wonder, who was the woman in the photo? His wife? His ex? And did she know what kind of man she was dealing with? I knew meeting up for coffee with a stranger was always a gamble, but nothing prepared me for this. The moment he walked through the door, I should have known something was off. He scanned the room like he owned it, then spotted me at the corner table. I raised a hand, nervous but polite, and he beamed like we were old friends. At first, I thought, okay, maybe this will be fine. He seems nice enough. Oh, how wrong I was. The first clue came the second he opened his mouth. "Hey," he boomed, loud enough to turn every head in the shop. Heads turned. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Even the barista froze mid-pour. I smiled awkwardly, hoping no one would remember this moment for long. Surely he'll settle down once we start talking, I thought. Surely. But no. He didn't have an inside voice. He didn't even have an outside voice. He had a megaphone. "So how long have you lived in the city?" he asked, as though I was standing across a field instead of sitting 2 feet away. People stared. Someone at a nearby table stifled a laugh. My ears were already ringing, and we hadn't even ordered coffee yet. "I just moved here last year. It's so different from my hometown." I chuckled nervously and tried lowering my voice, hoping he'd mirror me. "Oh, that's cool. I've been here for a while now," I said, just above a whisper. I was practically begging the universe for him to follow my lead. But he didn't. "Oh no," he doubled down. "Oh yeah? What do you do for work?" he bellowed, like we were in a stadium instead of a cozy cafe. I flinched. The entire shop didn't just overhear, they heard. Some people outright gawked. A couple at the next table leaned in like they were listening to a live podcast. I mumbled, desperately wishing I could disappear. "I work in marketing," he interrupted, yelling louder than before. "That's cool. My friend tried that once, but it sucked for him. Do you like it?" My soul left my body. I leaned closer, practically crawling across the table to hiss. "Could you, maybe lower your voice a bit?" But he didn't even hear me, or he ignored me. Instead, he barreled forward, oblivious to the fact that my face was burning and I was whispering like I was hiding state secrets. "I mean, you probably make good money, right? Is it enough for rent? I heard this area's super expensive." I glanced around. Kill me now, I thought. People weren't just glancing anymore. They were openly staring, some trying to suppress laughter, others watching like this was a live sitcom. I hadn't felt this much secondhand embarrassment since middle school. Desperate, I grabbed my coffee cup and muttered, "Let's take this outside." I was already halfway out the door before he caught on. Anything to escape the audience, I thought, practically sprinting to the sidewalk. Finally, he joined me, still grinning, completely unfazed. "So what's up?" he asked, voice still booming. Why is he still so loud? We're literally outside. I took a deep breath, channeling every ounce of patience I had left. Hey, I don't know how to say this, but you're really loud. Like really loud. I'm kind of uncomfortable, because everyone in there was staring at us. He blinked, surprised, then shrugged. Oh yeah, people tell me that all the time. Wait. What? People tell him this all the time? So he knows he's loud? And he just chooses to keep doing it? My brain short-circuited. I stared at him, trying to process this. Oh, I said finally, my voice flat. What else could I say? My patience evaporated like a puddle in the desert. Well, maybe you should work on that. He laughed, as if this was funny. As if my humiliation back there in the cafe was a joke. Yeah, I guess. Anyway, where do you want to go next? Where did I want to go next? Away. Far, far away. I plastered on a fake smile and said, you know what? I think I'm going to call it a day. But, nice meeting you. Good luck with everything. And with that, I walked away, heart pounding, ears still ringing from his voice. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. His voice echoed down the street behind me as he called out, bye. Great meeting you. Later, as I replayed the whole nightmare in my head, I couldn't decide if I was more horrified or amused. I mean, who doesn't have an inside voice? And if you know you're loud, if people have told you this multiple times, how do you not do something about it? I told my friends about it later, and they couldn't stop laughing. Oh my God, one of them said, wiping tears of laughter from her eyes. You met a human foghorn. Another chimed in, you're lucky you got out of there. Imagine being stuck on a road trip with him. They were right, of course. The whole thing was funny in hindsight, but in the moment, it was a horror story. A coffee shop catastrophe I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. The night started innocently enough, a casual group gathering at the pub where conversation flowed freely. We talked about movies, classics, franchises, upcoming releases. He seemed nice enough, chiming in with enthusiasm and a shared love for sci-fi. Then he asked, want to see the new Star Wars film with us? At the time, it sounded harmless. Us implied a group outing, friends bonding over a blockbuster. I agreed without hesitation, thinking it was just another casual plan. What I didn't know was that us meant just him. The realization hit me when I arrived at the cinema. I scanned the crowd for familiar faces, but only saw him rushing toward me, out of breath. Sorry I'm late, he said, waving a hand. My stupid dad didn't leave the house on time to drive me here. I froze for a second. This guy was in his 20s and had arrived with his dad as a chauffeur. Not the most promising start, but I brushed it off. Everyone's circumstances are different, I told myself. Maybe he'd redeem himself. He didn't. We grabbed popcorn. Well, he grabbed it, practically snatching the tub from the counter with a level of enthusiasm I hadn't seen in years. He began devouring it in fistfuls, not bothering to close his mouth as he chewed. Each loud crunch felt like nails on a chalkboard. People in the cinema turned to glance at us, but he didn't notice, or didn't care. The lights dimmed, and I hoped the movie would salvage the evening. It didn't. About 20 minutes in, I felt him lean closer. Very fit you are, he whispered in my ear. His voice was low and gravelly, like a bad Yoda impression, and I wasn't sure whether to cringe or laugh. I opted for neither, ignoring him in hopes he'd stop. He didn't. Every few minutes, there it was again. Very fit you are, The first time was awkward. The 10th was unbearable. I shifted in my seat, pretending to focus intensely on the movie, but he leaned in again, unfazed by my clear discomfort. By the time the credits rolled, I felt like I'd been held hostage in a sci-fi nightmare. The ordeal wasn't over. As we left the theater, he glanced around, his phone in hand. Can I grab a lift with you? He asked. I can't get hold of my dad, and I don't have money for a taxi. It was late, and I knew the walk back to our village was a solid 80 minutes. My dad's voice echoed in my head. Make sure everyone gets home safely. Reluctantly, I agreed. I just wanted the evening to be over. The car ride was mercifully quiet, though the popcorn crumbs on his shirt and the faint scent of butter lingering in the air were reminders of the chaos I'd just endured. As I pulled up outside his parents' house, I thought I'd made it out unscathed. Then he leaned in, not for a friendly peck or a polite thank you. He went for the full romantic kiss, his face coming toward mine like a slow-motion train wreck. I froze for a split second, then swerved just in time, his lips narrowly missing my cheek. He paused, clearly disappointed, then shrugged as if nothing had happened. I gave him a tight-lipped smile and mumbled, "Good night," watching as he trudged up the driveway. Relief washed over me as I drove away. Dodged a bullet there, I thought, determined to put the whole debacle behind me. But the story didn't end there. A week later, my phone rang. His name lit up on the screen, and against my better judgment, I answered. He asked me for a second date, his voice hopeful. I hesitated, unsure of how to let him down gently. I don't think we're a good match, I said, choosing my words carefully. There was silence on the other end. Then, without warning, he snapped. Fine, he barked, slamming the phone down so hard I could almost hear the echo. I stared at the phone in disbelief, a mix of annoyance and relief settling over me. At least it was over. No lingering awkwardness, no expectations, just a clean break from what was easily the worst date of my life. That night, as I recounted the experience to a friend, she laughed so hard she nearly spilled her drink. Lesson learned, she said between giggles. Always ask who's coming. It was advice I took to heart. From that point on, I made it a rule to clarify every plan, to double-check every detail before agreeing to anything. Because sometimes, the difference between a harmless group outing and a cringe-worthy solo date is just one poorly chosen pronoun. Now, years later, I still cringe when I think about that night. But I also laugh. It's one of those stories you tell at parties, the kind people can't believe actually happened. And while I haven't watched that Star Wars film again, I'll never forget the lesson it taught me. Trust your instincts and always know exactly what you're signing up for. I sat on the edge of the hotel bed, staring at the clock. The red numbers glared back at me, 9:47 p.m. He was supposed to be here hours ago. I'd been pacing the room for what felt like forever, texting and checking my phone every few minutes. The messages started casually enough, asking if he was close, but by now, I'd stopped bothering. The last reply I got was almost laughable. Heading your way soon. Left the game early for you winking face. Oh, how lucky I was. To be fair, the build-up to this moment had been nothing but good vibes. We'd been chatting on Tinder for weeks, 6 to be exact. Every day, without fail, there were messages, jokes, memes, late-night banter. When we finally met in person a couple of weeks ago, it had gone really well. The chemistry was electric, the kind that made you think, wow, maybe this is actually something. So when he suggested making a weekend of it, splitting a hotel room since he lived a couple of hours out of town, it felt like the natural next step. But now, sitting in this half-empty hotel room, the thrill of anticipation had been replaced with the cold sting of reality. He wasn't here. He'd rolled into town late, hours late, and instead of heading straight to the hotel, he'd gone to meet up with his friends. At the footy, the FODY. I couldn't help but replay his words over and over in my head. Left the game early for you. He said it like he deserved a medal, like this grand sacrifice of leaving his mates and a pint a little early was proof of his devotion. By the time he finally arrived, it was just past 10 p.m. The door creaked open, and there he was, all smiles, casual as if nothing was wrong. Hey babe, he said, tossing his bag onto the chair like this was the most normal scenario in the world. You should feel special, you know. I've never left a game early for a girl before. Oh, my God. I just stared at him, too stunned to even reply at first. Special? I was supposed to feel special because he dragged himself here 3 hours late after hanging out with his friends instead of keeping his word. The audacity of it all was almost comical. Almost. Wow, I said finally, my voice icy. What an honor. He either didn't catch the sarcasm or chose to ignore it because he flopped down on the bed next to me, acting like he'd just won boyfriend of the year. Yeah, the guys couldn't believe it, he said, laughing. But I told them, this girl's different. Different? Sure, I was different. Different enough to deserve being stood up in my own hotel room while he lived it up at a football game. Different enough to hear about how lucky I should feel for being someone's sloppy second priority. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm raging inside me. Part of me wanted to scream at him, to demand why he thought this was okay. But another part of me, cooler, quieter, more detached, realized something important. This wasn't just a bad night. This was a preview, a glimpse into how he operated, how he saw other people. Did you have fun? I asked, my tone dangerously even. He grinned. Yeah, it was great. I mean, it's always a good time with the boys, you know. But I knew I had to get back here for you. Like I said, I've never done that for anyone before. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Wow, I said again, standing up and grabbing my phone. You're really laying it on thick. His grin faltered. What do you mean? I turned to face him, finally letting the mask drop. I mean, you're acting like leaving a game a little early is some huge romantic gesture. Like I should be falling over myself with gratitude that you even bothered to show up at all." He blinked, clearly not expecting the shift in tone. "Well, I did come, didn't I? 3 hours late," I shot back. "After hanging out with your friends. You didn't even text me to let me know what was going on until I asked. Do you have any idea how disrespectful that is?" Now he was on the defensive. "Oh, come on. It's not like I bailed. I just wanted to see my friends first." "You're overreacting." Overreacting. The classic line. I almost laughed again. "Right," I said, grabbing my bag. Because expecting basic decency is such a high bar. He sat up, frowning now. "Wait, what are you doing?" "Leaving," I said simply. "You can have the room. I'll book somewhere else." "Wait, seriously?" he asked like he couldn't believe it. "You're really gonna throw a fit over this?" I paused at the door, looking back at him one last time. "It's not a fit. It's a boundary. Enjoy the rest of your night." And with that, I was gone. As I stepped into the elevator, my heart was racing, a mix of anger and relief flooding my chest. Part of me wondered if I'd overreacted, if I should have stayed and tried to talk it out. But deep down, I knew the truth. This wasn't just about the game, or the hotel, or the tardiness. It was about respect, or rather, the complete lack of it. The ride home the next morning felt lighter somehow. Sure, I was disappointed. It sucked to realize someone you had chemistry with wasn't who you thought they were. But there was a strange sense of empowerment too, knowing I'd walked away instead of settling for crumbs. The night started out innocently enough. She had matched with a guy on Tinder a week earlier, their conversations casual and lighthearted. He seemed charming, funny, and maybe a bit rough around the edges, but nothing that set off alarm bells. When he suggested meeting up, she hesitated, but decided to give him a chance. After all, everyone deserves one, right? But nothing could have prepared her for the moment he showed up at her door. When she opened it, her breath hitched. There he was, standing on her porch, a suitcase by his side. He wasn't the confident, laid-back guy she'd been texting. Instead, he was gaunt and jittery, like someone who had been running on fumes for days. And then there was the tattoo, an unmistakable Mike Tyson-style face tattoo sprawled across his cheek. Except he wasn't Mike Tyson. He was a skinny white guy whose presence screamed trouble. Before she could even greet him, he stepped forward, dragging the suitcase into her entryway like he belonged there. "Hey," he said, his voice casual as if this were a normal scenario. "Thanks for letting me crash here. I just got out of prison and didn't have anywhere else to go." Her stomach dropped. "Prison? Crash here?" She stared at him, her mind racing. This couldn't be real. She hadn't signed up for this, hadn't agreed to let a stranger, freshly released from who knows where, into her home. Her hand tightened on the doorknob, but he was already inside, standing awkwardly in her living room like a misplaced piece of furniture. I think there's been a misunderstanding," she stammered, trying to keep her voice steady. Her instincts screamed at her to get him out, but fear held her frozen in place. She tried to regain control of the situation. "I thought we were just meeting up." He shrugged, completely unfazed. "Yeah, but I figured it'd be easier this way. I didn't have anywhere else to go." She blinked, stunned by his audacity. "I don't think this is going to work," she said firmly, her voice shaking slightly. "You need to leave." But he didn't move. Instead, he sank onto her couch, letting out a long sigh like he'd just found a sanctuary. "It's been a long day," he muttered, rubbing his hands together. "I just need a place to figure things out." Panic bubbled up in her chest. She needed him gone, but every attempt to reason with him was met with nonchalance or outright dismissal. He acted as if this was perfectly normal, as if she were the one being unreasonable. Her mind raced with worst-case scenarios, the what-ifs growing darker with each passing second. Finally, she excused herself to the bathroom, her heart pounding as she locked the door behind her. She pulled out her phone, hands trembling as she dialed the police. Whispering into the receiver, she explained the situation as quickly and clearly as she could. "There's a man in my house," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He won't leave. He just got out of prison, and he brought a suitcase." The operator assured her that help was on the way, and told her to stay on the line. She tried to keep her breathing steady, every sound from the living room making her flinch. He was still there, muttering to himself, the suitcase now open on her floor. She didn't want to think about what could be inside. Minutes felt like hours as she waited, the tension in the air so thick it was suffocating. Finally, a knock at the door shattered the silence. She peeked out from the bathroom and saw the flashing red and blue lights through the front window. Relief flooded her, but it was short-lived. As the officers entered, the man stood up, his expression a mix of defiance and resignation. "What's this about?" he asked, his tone casual, as if he hadn't been squatting in a stranger's home uninvited. The officers wasted no time, guiding him out of the house while she stayed back, her body still trembling. One of them stayed behind to take her statement, reassuring her that she'd done the right thing. "You can't be too careful," the officer said. "People like that can be unpredictable." After they left, she stood in the middle of her living room, staring at the space where he'd been. The air still felt heavy, the tension lingering even in his absence. She locked the door, triple-checking it before collapsing onto her bed, the adrenaline finally draining from her system. She deleted Tinder the next day, vowing never to trust anyone online so easily again. It wasn't just about him. It was about the stark realization of how quickly things could spiral out of control, how a simple swipe could lead to a situation that felt like something out of a nightmare. In the weeks that followed, she told the story to a few close friends, each retelling met with gasps and disbelief. "A suitcase," one of them asked, wide-eyed. "And a face tattoo?" She nodded, laughing now that the fear had faded, but the lesson stuck with her. Trust wasn't something to be handed out freely, and boundaries weren't just a guideline, they were a necessity. The experience left her shaken, yes, but also stronger, more cautious, and far more aware of how quickly a seemingly normal situation could turn into anything but. The theater was pitch black, and the movie had already started by the time I made it back from the bathroom. My heart was pounding, partly because I'd been so excited about this date, and partly because I was already second-guessing everything. This was one of my first ever dates, and I'd spent the entire day hyping myself up to make sure everything went perfectly. So, naturally, I was a ball of nerves as I shuffled awkwardly back to what I thought was my seat. The theater was crowded, the kind of packed that makes every row feel like a maze. I fumbled my way through the darkness, murmuring apologies as I squeezed past people, and finally found what I was certain was my spot. I eased into the seat, trying not to draw attention to myself, and glanced at the silhouette next to me. I couldn't see much in the dim glow of the screen, but I thought I caught a glimpse of her hair, the curve of her profile. "That's definitely her," I told myself, settling in and trying to relax. The movie was a blur. I barely paid attention, my mind racing with nervous energy. Should I say something? Try to hold her hand? Or would that make things weird? I kept glancing at her out of the corner of my eye, my heart skipping every time I thought she shifted closer. But something felt off. She wasn't laughing at the funny parts or reacting to the intense scenes. She didn't even seem to notice me. Maybe she was just really into the movie, I thought. I didn't want to overthink it, so I sat there trying to convince myself that everything was fine. It wasn't. When the lights came up at the end of the film, I turned to say something to her, only to realize that the girl sitting next to me wasn't my date at all. My stomach dropped like I'd missed a step on a staircase. She looked at me, confused, and then glanced at the guy on her other side, who also seemed baffled by my presence. Panic surged through me as I scanned the rows in front of me. There she was, 2 rows ahead, sitting exactly where I'd left her, looking around as if trying to spot me. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. I'd been sitting with complete strangers for the entire movie. I don't even know how I missed it. Maybe I was too nervous, too caught up in my own head, to notice that I'd sat in the wrong row. Or maybe I was just so preoccupied with not embarrassing myself that I'd somehow managed to embarrass myself in the worst way possible. The girl I'd accidentally sat next to gave me a small, awkward smile before turning back to her date, who was clearly trying to figure out what was going on. My face burned as I mumbled a quick apology and practically tripped over myself getting out of the row. I could feel everyone's eyes on me as I made my way down to where my actual date was sitting, but I didn't dare look up to confirm it. She turned as I approached, her expression a mix of confusion and mild amusement. "Where were you?" she asked, trying not to laugh. I stammered something about getting lost in the dark, but my face was so hot I could barely string a sentence together. I thought I was sitting here," I said, gesturing vaguely toward the row I'd just vacated. Her laugh was kind, but I could feel the second-hand embarrassment radiating off her. "You sat with another couple?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "Apparently," I muttered, wishing I could disappear into the sticky carpet of the theater. We walked out together, and she was nice enough not to tease me too much about it, but the damage was done. I replayed the moment over and over in my head, cringing at how clueless I must have looked. The worst part was knowing that the couple I'd sat next to probably spent the entire movie wondering who the hell I was and why I'd planted myself in their row like I belonged there. Even now, years later, the memory of that night makes my stomach twist. It wasn't just the embarrassment of sitting in the wrong seat, it was the sheer absurdity of the situation. I'd been so focused on making a good impression, so worried about messing things up, that I didn't even notice I'd messed up in the most spectacular way possible. Looking back, I can laugh about it, kind of, but in the moment, it felt like the end of the world. I mean, what's more horrifying than realizing you've spent an entire date literally sitting in the wrong place? It was like something out of a bad comedy, except I was living it, and the punchline was my complete and utter lack of awareness. To her credit, my date was a good sport about it. We didn't end up going out again, but I like to think it wasn't because of my theater faux pas. At least, that's what I tell myself. But the whole experience taught me one valuable lesson. Sometimes, the scariest thing about dating isn't the fear of rejection or the awkward silences. It's realizing you've accidentally been in the wrong place the entire time. The waiter had barely stepped away when she started crying, full on, head in her hands, can't catch her breath crying. I froze, unsure if I'd accidentally said something offensive in the last 30 seconds. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice laced with panic. She sniffled, wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, and blurted out, "It's just, me and my ex-boyfriend used to order the same thing." I blinked. Slowly. She was crying because I ordered water, and she got a Coke. The same drinks she and her ex used to get. My brain scrambled for an appropriate response. But what do you even say to that? I'm sorry." She shook her head furiously, tears streaming down her face. "It's not your fault," she sobbed. "I just didn't expect it to hit me this hard." Hit her this hard? Over beverages? I stared down at the untouched glass of water in front of me, suddenly feeling like it was radioactive. I glanced around the restaurant, hoping no one was watching, but it felt like every eye in the place was on us. "Hey, it's okay," I said awkwardly, wishing I could melt into my chair. "You don't have to think about him. Let's just enjoy the meal." But that was easier said than done. She was inconsolable, sniffling through the appetizer and clutching a napkin like it was her lifeline. The more I tried to cheer her up, the worse it seemed to get. She kept looking at me with these big, watery eyes, like she thought I might vanish into thin air at any second. Then came the paranoia. "Promise me you're not going to leave," she said out of nowhere, her voice trembling. "When I go to the bathroom, you won't just walk out, right?" Her words hit me like a slap. "What?" I asked, genuinely startled. "Why would I do that?" "Guys do that to me sometimes," she whispered, her gaze dropping to the table. "They just leave." My stomach twisted. On one hand, I felt bad for her, really bad. She clearly had been through some stuff. But on the other hand, I couldn't ignore the weight of what she'd just said. Guys had walked out on her mid-date. What kind of disaster dates had she been on to make her think that was a real possibility? More importantly, what did that say about how this night was going? "I'm not going anywhere," I said firmly, trying to reassure her. She nodded, but I could tell she didn't fully believe me. She went to the bathroom, and for the few minutes she was gone, I sat frozen at the table, acutely aware of the stares from the nearby tables. The weight of her earlier comment hung in the air. I'd promised I wouldn't leave, and I meant it, but there was a tiny, nagging part of me that wondered if I should have. What have I gotten myself into? When she came back, her mood had shifted. The tears were gone, replaced by an odd sort of manic energy. She sat down, leaned in close, and said, "Do you want to go to the mall after this?" I frowned, confused. "The mall?" She nodded, her eyes wide and almost excited. "There's a piercing place there. I've been thinking about getting my nipples done." My brain short-circuited. Nipples? I could barely process what was happening. Wow, I managed to stammer. "That's bold. You'll come with me, right?" she asked, smiling now. It was the first time all night she didn't look like she was about to cry, but the sudden shift was almost more unsettling. "I don't know if that's really my scene," I said cautiously. I was already mentally preparing my exit plan, but she wasn't listening. She was too busy talking about how much it would hurt, or not hurt, and whether I thought a barbell or hoops would look better. I nodded along, trying to keep up, but my mind was racing. This wasn't just an awkward date anymore. It was something else entirely, something I didn't have the tools to handle. The crying, the paranoia, the nipple-piercing detour. What was next? When the check came, I grabbed it, hoping to wrap this up as quickly as possible. "Let me take care of this," I said, trying to sound polite. "No," she said sharply, snatching the check out of my hand. A girl can pay her own way. I didn't argue. At that point, I was just grateful for anything that sped up the process of ending this bizarre, emotionally charged evening. We walked out together, the air between us heavy with unspoken weirdness. She looked up at me expectantly as we reached the sidewalk, and I realized with a sinking feeling that she was waiting for me to suggest we head to the mall. Instead, I gestured toward the parking lot. "Your car's this way, right?" "Oh," she said, clearly disappointed. "Yeah, I guess." I walked her to her car, doing my best to keep the mood light. When we got there, she turned to me, hesitating as if she wanted to say something profound. I braced myself, but all she managed was a quiet, "Thanks for tonight." "Of course," I said quickly, stepping back. "Take care." She drove off, and I stood there for a moment, letting the tension drain from my shoulders. The relief was almost overwhelming. I climbed into my own car, sat in silence for a moment, and then laughed, this incredulous, shaky laugh that came from pure disbelief. "What was that?" The dim glow of the bar's neon sign flickered in the window as I checked my phone for the 10th time. 7:32 p.m. He was officially late. My gut told me to call it and leave, but I brushed it off. He's probably stuck in traffic, I told myself, trying to be patient. We'd been talking for a week, and he seemed like a decent guy. Divorced, a dad, in his 30s, someone who'd get the importance of showing up on time. When he finally strolled in, nearly 30 minutes late, I gave him the benefit of the doubt. That was mistake number one. "Sorry about that," he said, flashing me a smile that was just a little too confident for someone who'd kept me waiting. Without missing a beat, he flagged down the waitress and ordered a beer and a shot of Fireball. Then he turned to me with an almost rehearsed grin. "You want one too?" I hesitated. A shot and a beer on a Wednesday night wasn't really my thing, but I didn't want to seem uptight. "Sure," I said, forcing a smile. He clinked his shot glass against mine, and I braced myself as the cinnamon burn hit my throat. At first, the conversation was fine. He was chatty, maybe a little too chatty. Words spilled out of him like a dam had broken, and no matter what I said, he interrupted me. Compliments flew like confetti. "You're so smart. You're gorgeous. I love the way you think." Nice, sure, but they came so fast and so often that I couldn't even finish a thought. Every time I tried to steer the conversation somewhere meaningful, he'd bulldoze right over me. But the real red flags started piling up with the drinks. By the time he was halfway through his third beer and second shot, I was already eyeing the clock. He wasn't slowing down. "Another round?" he asked, signaling the waitress before I could even respond. "Maybe we should order some food," I suggested, hoping to sober him up a bit. Burgers arrived, and for a brief moment, I thought things were stabilizing. Then he chased his meal with yet another shot and 2 more beers. By 9:30, he was buzzing hard, talking even faster, slurring just enough to make me uncomfortable. Meanwhile, I nursed my second beer, counting down the minutes until I could politely call it a night. When the check came, I grabbed my bag, hoping this was the end of it. But as we walked toward the exit, the waitress came running after us. "Hey," she called, glancing nervously at him. "Are you driving tonight? You've had a lot to drink." He scoffed, waving her off. "I'm fine," he said, his words a little too sharp. "I have a high tolerance. I didn't even drink that much." The waitress shot me a concerned look, and I felt my stomach twist. "Maybe you should order an Uber," I said, trying to keep my voice light. "Just to be safe." "I'm fine," he insisted, his tone more insistent now. Then he leaned in closer, the smell of Fireball and stale beer heavy on his breath. "But hey, I was thinking, maybe I could come back to your place." The alarm bells were deafening now. "Oh, I have to work early," I stammered, taking a step back. He looked hurt, almost weepy, and before I could react, he leaned in, trying to kiss me. I turned my head just in time, mumbling something about next time, and darted to my car as quickly as I could. I never heard from him again, and trust me, I didn't lose sleep over it. I have another story to tell. I mean, if I thought that date was bad, the next one came with a whole new level of unease. This time, it was a paramedic, divorced, good-looking, and fresh off a long shift. We met at a quiet diner, and I was cautiously optimistic. He seemed normal enough when we first sat down, but as the meal progressed, things started to unravel. It started innocently enough, small talk about his job, his kids. But then he brought up his ex-wife. At first, it was the usual venting. Things didn't work out, they fought a lot, co-parenting was hard. But then his tone shifted, and the things he said, they weren't just bitter. They were dark. She's bleeding me dry with child support, he muttered, stabbing at his fries. I'd love to hire someone to take care of her. You know what I mean? My heart stopped. He laughed, but it wasn't the kind of laugh that made you feel at ease. It was cold, humorless, and the way he looked at me afterward, like he was waiting for me to agree, sent a chill down my spine. I forced a smile, my pulse racing. That sounds really hard, I said carefully, trying not to escalate the situation. Every instinct in me was screaming to get out of there, but I didn't want to make him angry. I didn't want to be the next person he casually wished violence upon. After that, the conversation stalled. He picked at his food, occasionally muttering about how unfair life was. I nodded along, pretending to listen, all the while planning my exit. The second the check came, I practically threw my card at the waitress, eager to end the night. Outside, I mumbled something about having an early morning and walked to my car as quickly as I could. He didn't try to stop me, didn't even say goodbye. He just stood there in the parking lot, staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. I drove home in silence, my hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. The whole way, I kept replaying his words in my head. I'd love to hire someone to take care of her. It wasn't a joke. I could feel it in my gut. He meant it. Like the first guy, I never heard from him again. And honestly, I'm glad. But those nights stuck with me. Not just because they were bad dates, but because they reminded me how quickly things can go from awkward to downright dangerous. Now, every time I agree to meet someone new, I double-check my escape plan. Because sometimes, you don't know who you're sitting across from until it's too late. I had been sent to Korea from my university a few years ago. They told me for my major I had to go somewhere in Asia, and my friend had really talked up Korea for me. I knew nothing about it, but I decided what the hell. And I embarked on a semester-long trip. I had only had one serious boyfriend in my life, who I had broken up with a few months prior. I also don't enjoy one-night stands, and wasn't digging the dudes at the clubs in Seoul. But I still wanted to have some sort of romantic experience, I suppose, so my friend recommended I use this dating app to meet English-speaking Koreans. That way I could meet someone and experience the actual dating culture. I thought I'm young, so why not? I was just so eager to have new experiences. Maybe it sounds dumb to try dating in a foreign country, but it worked out for me eventually. Not the first date. I met him on a dating app after being in Seoul about 3 weeks. Let's call him Tim. I still didn't know the culture or city very well, and was a bit naive about everything. He eagerly wanted to meet for a date after talking to me, and he seemed nice. I should have asked more questions, and I should have noticed that he was not giving me many details about himself. Tim was a guy a bit older than me, but claimed he was a college student. I assumed he had done his military time, all men in Korea have to, and returned to school. We talked for a bit, and decided to meet for a tea date near the school I went to. He wanted to come to my dorm originally to pick me up, but I live in an all-women's dorm, and I didn't want him to know exactly where I lived since we were still strangers. So instead I insisted we meet at the main town center near the subway. He really didn't like this idea, which looking back was a red flag. But eventually I insisted. The night of the date, I waited an hour for this guy. He was very late. Tim weirdly claimed he just wanted to make me wait. I thought he was kidding and messaged him a laughing emoji, assuming he was just lost. When he finally arrived, he was much smaller than I thought, but a man's height has never been something I care about much. He was also quite thin. Maybe I let my guard down because I didn't see him as physically threatening to me, which was a mistake in the end. Right off the bat, he was way too touchy with me, and breathed creepy and heavy. I was so off-put with his demeanor. I'm usually very tolerant with different personality types, but this was very odd to me. I had been told that Korean men would be polite and not so touchy on the first date. He was also dressed oddly, like in business attire for a date, but I thought that maybe it's just a Korean thing. Again, I was dumb and knew jack shit about the culture. Then, the first thing he said to me was, "You're not as white as I thought you were." I thought this was a translation error, but his English was near perfect. So I asked for clarification, and he said what he meant. "I thought you would be more white. Your skin is darker than I thought, and your eyes aren't as green. Are you pure European?" Now I was officially weirded out. First of all, I'm pretty much as white as you can get. I'm Irish and Scandinavian, so white as hell basically. So the fact he thought I could have possibly been any whiter was funny. And why did he care in the first place anyway? Why does my skin color matter to this guy? And why is he bringing it up? He said about 3 times on the date how he wished I had greener eyes. And every time I would just reply, well, maybe my online photos make me look brighter, and brushed it off as in being nervous and trying to start a conversation. Isn't it funny the dumb excuses you make for people when you're panicked? When we arrived at the tea place, I tried to order a basic raspberry tea, and he stopped me and told me I had to have this special tea. I thought it was weird he wanted to choose my tea for me, but in my head I brushed it off once again. He really insisted I drink only this tea type, and I just agreed. These small details become weirder later. After tea he asked if we could look around my school. It was dark, but the school is very well lit, so I agreed. And the whole time we walked around, he would randomly stop and grab me for long hugs. At first I let it happen, but then I stopped him. And he just kept trying. He kept grabbing me and breathing hard into my neck. It was so awkward. He also would not tell me any personal details about himself. I asked so many questions, desperately trying to distract from all the awkward grabbing and to try and get to know him. But he would never tell me anything. He even said at one point, "I'm a mysterious man," like a movie line. He also said something like, "You look so much like my favorite movie character," and I asked who. But he said that I would have to figure it out on my own. Finally he said, "I want to go to a dark area," and in my head I screamed hell no. At this point I wanted the date over fast. He somehow knew there was a wooded area behind my campus, and he said we should go there. I said no, and that I wanted to stay near the main campus in town. But he kept pushing. Finally he grabbed my arm and started dragging me there. He said I can't let anyone see, and I started to panic. I finally ripped my arm away and just demanded we leave and go back to the main road immediately. Looking back, I don't know why I didn't ask for help or get angry. Maybe I was scared. But I just began to book it back to the main road, and he followed. We ended up in front of a hospital near the center of town, and I told him it was time for him to go. I made some excuse, and he was pleading with me to stay. I told him we could meet the next day. I lied, and I would message him. I just wanted to get away at this point. I was pretending it was all okay, just so he would leave. Suddenly, I think he's leaning in to kiss me, and I immediately think, oh God, no. But it was so much worse. Instead, I feel pain in my face. It takes me a second to realize he was biting my face. It was like a dog. I had never felt the sensation before. He leaned his head sideways and bit me on my nose and cheek as hard as he could. I screamed and pushed him away from me. His face looked so freaky, and I barely had time to react in words. Instead, I ran up the sidewalk until I saw a convenience store on the right. I ran to the back of the store and bent down to start crying. The man who owned the store started to yell at me, but I couldn't explain my situation. I just begged him in English to let me stay. I ended up having to buy a popsicle to stick around. God, I wish I had learned some Korean by then. I guess Tim didn't follow me. I peered outside the store and didn't see him. I texted a friend and waited for them to get me to take me back to my dorm. On the way I messaged Tim and basically told him to stay away from me. I told him he was a creep, that he shouldn't bite women, and something along the lines of me calling the police. And then I blocked him. I was so scared to walk around my school area after that. I was so afraid he would find me somehow. I am so thankful I never let him pick me up at my dorm. I called my mom to tell her what happened when suddenly she said, "Wait, what did he ask you?" She then put some details together and realized that all of these weird things had to do with the 50 Shades of Grey books. At first I thought she was just being silly and overthinking a bad date. I thought she was joking, but oh God, she was right. She had recently seen the movie or read the book of something and knew the details. The eye color and way he dressed, and the tea he made me drink and the random lines he said. It all matches the books and movies. For his dirty little fantasy. My mom thinks he picked me because I look like the girl in that movie to him. It explains why he was so fixated on my appearance. And his whole thing with the biting and trying to dominate me. Even if it wasn't his intention, I later learned that there are some few creeps who seek out foreign girls to dominate and have sex with as like a prize. They call it riding the white horse or something along those lines. On a happier note, this bad experience didn't stop me. I eventually met someone else in Korea, and we ended up falling in love. We even did the whole long distance thing, and now I'm living in Korea studying and working, hoping to marry soon. So I guess I didn't let bad creepy guys stop my life. So I had just gotten out of a pretty significant relationship with someone of 4 years, nearly engaged and moving in together, etc. When things fell apart, I took a good amount of time to be on my own and get my shit together again, when my friends began encouraging me to get back out there. Needless to say, I really wasn't wanting anything at that point, nor looking for anything. But they insisted that I at least just go out on a few casual dates for practice, just to kind of get my skills back up for when I was ready. I think they were honestly just worried because I had become quite hermetic. So I matched with this girl, who's home from college for the summer. She's a little out of the way from me, but was eager to meet, seemed really interested, was even willing to come to my area, etc. I really wasn't all that interested to be truthful, but my friends again encouraged this. Practice, whatever that means. A date doesn't mean commitment. Whatever. I want to be very clear, though, that I was extremely honest and explicit with her that I was not looking for anything serious, or anything really at all. I was very forthcoming that I had gotten out of something serious, and I was just kind of encouraged to explore. She persisted and still wanted to meet, so we agreed to a casual lunch in a sports bar that week. I get there, and she was already waiting for me. I was a bit put off by how much different she looked than her pictures. Not trying to sound shallow or anything, but her pics from Tinder easily had to be at least 5 years old, which I verified based on tattoos she had in person, versus ones she didn't in pics. So I was a bit thrown off by that. I wasn't the least bit attracted to her, but I was there to just have new experiences anyway, right? No big deal. I felt so bad, because the entire time she seemed so incredibly shy and awkward. I even noticed her hand shaking when she reached for her glass, which I found endearing honestly. So I did my best to get her talking, and try to help her feel more relaxed. I asked her questions, and chatted about things I figured you'd chat about on dates. Where she grew up, music she's into, school she goes to, major, etc. All to which I literally received one-word answers. It went on like this for about an hour, and she was just not working with me at all. But I tried to keep room in my heart, because it was clear she was feeling anxious, and I understand that on a personal level. Then she pulls out this book and says, "I got this for you." And I responded very grateful, thanking her, and inquiring what it was about, 'cause hey, if someone wants to share a good read with me, I'm all for that. She looks at me funny and says in a very sudden, but odd tone, "You're kidding, right?" I'm very confused, and just kind of look at her like, and she says, "This is your favorite book. You told me this was your favorite book." To which I said, "No? I have never even heard of this before," so we concluded that she ultimately got me confused with someone else she must have been chatting, which I honestly found hilarious, lol. She was embarrassed, but I made light of it and said I found it funny, 'cause I get it, that's Tinder culture, I guess. So as we finished lunch, and I'm still receiving one-word answers despite our funny moment, I kind of become a bit suggestive that we should conclude our date by saying I had to get back to feed my animals and do some laundry, etc. But she became very adamant on spending more time, and asked if we could do something else. I was genuinely trying to be a decent person, so I agreed, and we found a nearby park to walk. That's where shit gets weird. We sat on a park bench, mind you it's broad daylight. There's kids playing basketball nearby, folks jogging past. I start trying to make conversation yet again, but still get the one-word answers. Then out of seemingly nowhere, without any warning whatsoever, she proceeds to just kiss me really aggressively, tongue and everything. I was honestly just so shocked I stood there frozen, not knowing what the fuck to do. I had this timid, shy woman, who's really not made much conversation with me at all, who was so nervous she was visibly shaking, just turned into a freaking bear mauling my face in like 0.6 seconds. My head was spinning with confusion and anxiety, and I swear it felt like it lasted forever, and I just prayed for it to stop. I was so put off and honestly a bit afraid to do or say anything. Like, what do you even do in that situation? I was just hoping she'd pick up on my very obvious body language, that I wasn't reciprocating anything at all. I was completely unprepared for a situation like this. Then some really nasty guy walks by, gawking and catcalling, and literally begins propositioning us into a three-way. And I'm just like, what the fuck is going on? I need to get out of here. I was 1,000 different types of uncomfortable. I end up managing to ward him off after telling him very politely, no more than several times, all the while she's just laughing. And I'm thinking, who even are you? Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde over here, WTF. So he leaves and I'm insisting now that I need to leave and go home. She seems to ignore what I'm saying and gets very close to my face again and says, "Did you like that? Do you think I'm sexy? Do you want me?" When I tell you I was so fucking nervous. I was like, I really need to get home. And she was like, "Can I come?" And I told her very firmly no. She literally tried to persuade me to let her come back to my place with me, and I had to say no more than 3 times. So finally I'm home, and frankly just kind of shaken up. I hadn't really done the dating thing in quite a long time, but that felt very abnormal. She then texts me after she gets home and asks me out on a second date. And I was very kind, despite being made incredibly uncomfortable, and I told her I thought she was a very cool chick and I had a nice time, but that I did not feel anything there, and reminded her I wasn't looking for anything. She then text-bombed me a bunch of crazy shit, saying how she didn't understand and was so confused, that she thought I was so into her and that things went great. I did not respond to any of these because now she's continuing to cross my boundaries. I said what I needed to say, and I thought I was being decent by at least being honest. So the texts continued, and I figure they're going to eventually stop because it was a first date. How can someone be so upset over someone not reciprocating on a first date? They did not stop. By the texts, you would have thought we just ended a 2-year relationship. Then she began calling, at which point I had to block her number. So back in June 2022 I met Wilton Wallace on Hinge. I'm from Victoria, Australia. He was from Queensland but was working in Victoria and was 28 at the time. I was 24. We hit it off, and within a day of chatting he asked to meet me in the city for drinks. He seemed friendly and cute, so why not get dressed up and give him a chance? Funnily enough, my spidey senses were tingling already, but I just thought it was usual nerves of a first date. I should have trusted my gut, but he hadn't given me any red flags yet. He met me at Flinders Street Station. First impression was he dressed really nice, suit and long coat, clearly took pride in his looks. Instantly he was super affectionate, way more than I'm used to. He kissed my cheek, picked me up, squeezed the crap of me, and we were hand in hand from the get-go. Although I was taken aback, he was of Brazilian descent, and I know their culture can be quite forward. I wasn't overly alarmed, but this was within 10 seconds of meeting Grinning Face with Sweat. So we decide to go for drinks, and he recommends a very well-known fancy bar. I'm just a nurse, so way above my pay grade, but he said would like to cover the whole night. It became apparent very quickly he's super chivalrous, charming, and a sweet talker. It felt like a soppy 2000s rom-com, I can't lie. He was super open about his life, and because he was, so was I. We had so much in common, and everything just felt right. It makes me want to gag now I know the real him. If it feels too good to be true, it probably is. Basically, the life story he threw up all over me was that he was born in Brazil. His parents had a family business and were well off but lost it somehow. Think he said his dad died, R.I.P. Dad. His mom couldn't afford to care for him and his 4 sisters alone, so she gave him up for adoption, and he moved to Portugal. I guess he was the run of the litter because she kept the 4 girls. So he grew up in Portugal from about 5 until he was 17, when he decided to move back to his biological mother. He said his Portuguese family were lovely but incredibly religious, and he didn't like the constraints, arranged marriage, no boinking before marriage type deal. So at 17 he moves back to Brazil and builds his relationship with his biological mother, and eventually he decided to move to Australia. He moved over to study some aerodynamic bullshit degree for some career I don't give a flying fuck about. Fast forward 11 years to 2022, and now he works in Queensland as some manager for shipping companies and flies to and from Melbourne for work every few weeks. Now you're up to speed with that crock of shit. Let's get back to the date. I had a traumatic upbringing, neglect, poverty, raised by grandparents and so on. So hearing all that really touched me. The man had me in the palm of his slimy hands. I felt at times he was cocky and had an ego on him, but he even mentioned he can come across cocky, and reassured me that's how some people perceive him, but he's not at all. So clearly someone's pulled him up for being an arrogant twat before. The date is progressing, and we're having huge DNMS. He was ticking so many boxes. We spoke about how I love to dance, and always wanted to learn salsa, so he suggested a studio that does weekend night classes, but it had sold out. So he asked if I'd go back to his place, just to hang out. I don't know what this man put in my drink, not literally, just FYI, but my common sense was gone. I told him I needed to go home before midnight, and was only coming over to talk. Anyway, we get to his apartment, and like the scene from Crazy Stupid Love, he lights candles, puts on salsa music, pours a heavy glass of red for us, and asks if he can teach me how to salsa in his tiny living room. Like, was I Kate Hudson in How to Lose a Guy in 10 Days? I obliged because my fanny flutters are in full control of my functioning at this point. We end up making out, and things get hot and heavy, but I stuck to my guns and didn't let him pass my chastity belt. Don't get me wrong, I have had one-night stands before, but I had turned a new leaf, and my rule was now 3 dates minimum. Long story short, but not short at all, we ended up falling asleep together, and I was full clothed. How about that? We woke up the next morning, and he took me out for breakfast before ordering me an Uber home. Keep in mind that was the one and only time I physically met him, and it was PG rated. A few days later things were getting weird. He started making grandiose gestures and love bombing. Without asking, he bought me lingerie. He didn't know my size and had never seen me in lingerie. He bought me jewelry for my birthday just 1 week after we met, and then the grand prize, an all-inclusive holiday to Queensland. I said yes because YOLO, right? Like literally, I might die, but at least my tombstone would say I was living my best life. He told me on the trip we'd go to a private restaurant his friend owns, a helicopter ride, and a cruise on a yacht, amongst a bunch of other completely insane things. He paid for the flights and told me not to bring lingerie, because he had that covered face vomiting. My red flag alarms were going off at this point. Like, is he a sugar daddy, or am I about to be trafficked in the lingerie and jewelry he just bought me? Think about it. Dude works for a shipping company. Perfect way to ship me off to the market. So at this point my stomach is turning, and I'm getting SUS. I realized I hadn't really done much digging on him, and if I was going interstate with this schmoozy wet sock I needed to know everything. I spent hours with my housemate investigating. His Facebook was on total lockdown. This was before you could lock your profile. And his Insta had no signs of family. He barely had any tagged photos with people, and the photos he did have were from years ago in Brazil. All the photos he had were just him solo and traveling, so I started questioning everything. Was his name even Wilton Wallace? Doesn't sound Brazilian or Portuguese. Sounds more like Donald Duck or Chuck E. Cheese to me. So we searched his number on my bank app using PayID. Lo and behold, W. Vega dos Santos comes up. Exploding head, change for anonymity. I'm shitting bricks now, like who the fuck is this toenail I've been wasting my time with? So I go deeper. I'm going through all of his Insta followers looking for any remnants of him. I find a mutual in the deep dark cave I've got myself into, and there it is. A group photo of him from around 2016, holding a Brazilian woman that looks about 35, and the comments mention, "Love you both, can't wait to see you two again." Couldn't confirm if they were married, but that's where my money was. I dig more and more to find who she is. I can't find anything, but I had a lead on what her name might be, so I head to Google and search both her name and his Vega dos I'm a fucking liar name. After sifting through countless pages I can't read because they're in Spanish and poorly translated, I find a settlement document. It was a civil dispute about a debt, but both their full names were there. To my delight, his full name in the case was Wilton Wallace Vega dos Santos. I don't blame him for going by the easiest of the 5 name, but one truth doesn't fix a truck of lies. So now I'm thinking I've gone mad and overthinking. Maybe he's just divorced and doesn't post a lot? Nope. Whilst doing our investigations, I asked him to send his passport, so my friends had his details when I went to Queensland, to be safe. He sends me his passport after hours of waiting, and he had blacked out info and covered his face. Dumb fuck didn't cover his date of birth well enough though, because would you look at that? This absolute toad was born in 1986, making him 36. Now I saw through his bullshit, but I wanted to flip the game for a little while. I had to do it for the plot. I confronted him about it. He made up some shit about how when he was registered in Portugal they stuffed up the date. Didn't know a 5-year-old could look 13, but there you have it. Over the next few weeks he kept cancelling and changing Queensland plans days before each rescheduled flight. There was always another issue. I went along with it. I had no intention of going, but wanted to see his cunning plot come to fruition. Maybe it wasn't trafficking. Maybe he was going to magically lose all his money and get cancer and need my help to survive. And then I get a message that broke the camel's back. His grandma in Portugal was sick, so he had to fly there ASAP. I literally laughed when I read it. I was super short and apathetic with him. Next day grandma died of a stroke. Boo-hoo. Some may think my digging went a bit too far at this point, but I ended up messaging the woman from the Insta photo and legal document because I just had a horrible gut feeling there was more to all of this, and I was sick of the games. It definitely felt like I was crossing a line, but I had to know. She ended up messaging me back that she unfortunately did know him and wanted to tell me everything over the phone. What she told me blew my fucking mind. Excuse my language, but this C***T was the biggest narcissistic, pathological lying, cheating scumbag I had ever had the displeasure of knowing. He had lied about it all. He was 36, born and raised by his mom and dad in Brazil his entire life. He had brothers, not 4 sisters. He never lived in Portugal. Grandma was still alive and kicking. He studied social work and was now studying to become a physiotherapist. nothing to do with Arrow whatever the fuck. I don't even know what the shipping container place has to do with any of it, but he'd sent me Insta stories of him working there, so that's scary. He was the same charming suave man to his ex-wife, who he married in Brazil, and they moved to Queensland shortly after. As soon as they arrived, he became financially and emotionally abusive to her and refused to get a job. She worked and paid for the bills, his social work degree, random business trips, and whatever else this scumbag pretended he did. Side note, please do not try and find her. She would like to remain anonymous as she is scared of her ex-husband and what he is capable of. After being in Queensland for 5 years, she got a message from a 24-year-old Australian girl. Same age I was at the time, and it turned out they'd been dating for 3 years. They'd met at uni, and he'd been using her to do all his university work. She was told the same life story as me, but the poor thing never questioned it. She believed the crap about his age too. She realized through a mutual uni friend that saw a photo of him and said she thought he was married. Thank fuck for that friend. So Wilton and his wife get divorced, and the 24-year-old kicks him to the curb. But only a year later, another girl reaches out to his now ex-wife. Same story. 24-year-old Australian girl told the same bullshit life story and believed it. They'd been together 4 years, and he was using her to pay for his lifestyle and clothes. 2 years go by. His ex-wife just hoped he had finally come to his senses, but afraid not. I was the third girl to reach out to her. My guess is he's still got a few girls on the go at a time. His plans probably kept changing because of them, and one of them probably pays for his plane trips every few weeks. Fuck, the holiday, jewelry and lingerie was probably some other woman's hard-earned money as well. Needless to say, I was furious. I ended up ghosting him, because that's the best way to piss of a narcissist. He messaged me for weeks on text, Insta, WhatsApp and FB. Eventually I decided to give him a taste of his own medicine. I told him I knew some things, and he needed to come clean. I never mentioned what or how I knew, but he said he'd be fully transparent and fly down to Melbourne to see me. He probably thought I knew 1% of the truth. I thought about actually seeing him and seeing what bullshit he'd come up with next, but I was done. I told him I was about 5 hours from the city, in a town that's so small there's only one train to get there a day. I said I couldn't pick him up from the airport, but he could stay a few days. I'd show him the real Australian country, and I'd drive him back to the airport at the end of his visit. So after catching 2.5-hour flight, and sitting on a train for 5 hours to go to the middle of nowhere, I asked him to send a photo of where he was so I could find him. He'd actually done it faced with tears of joy. I was at home in my pajamas watching a movie, and he was at a train station in the rain, 5 fucking hours away from the airport, and stuck until the next day. Pure gold. I can only imagine how pissed he would have been. I sent him a message I had ready and waiting for that exact moment. I waited for a reply, so I knew he got it, then blocked the piece of shit on everything and never looked back. So there you go. Stay safe out there and always trust your instincts. Years ago I posted this on a Melbourne forum, and unfortunately there were a lot of girls that had met him online or for a date, but thankfully they all got the same vibes as me before it went too far. However, I was the only one crazy enough to find out who the scumbag really was. I just hope he hasn't been able to trick any more since my run-in with him. And if they have been, I hope they find out the truth. If you somehow find this asshole on the streets or online, do as you please. Just please don't contact his ex-wife for her protection. Back in 2013, I was freshly single and new in town, so I made a profile on Plenty of Fish, a site and mobile app dating service. I used primarily for coffee dates, but after I started making friends, I got a little more comfortable with the idea of going out at night. I typically employed the buddy system and really never had a problem with any weirdos in person. I had been talking to this guy Dave Asterisk for about a week before we made our first plans to go out. I had invited a female coworker along, and he said that was no problem, he'd bring a friend also. However, at the last minute he said his friend was feeling anxious and couldn't be persuaded to go. I assured him my coworker wasn't looking for a date, but he understandably, at the time, declined as to no make things awkward for anyone. Without much thought, my coworker and I still went to the bar Dave had suggested. It was a popular place, sue me. I chatted with Dave for a bit more through the app before I gave him number. It seemed harmless. Now that he had my number, I felt strange that we hadn't actually met, so I suggested a coffee date. He bailed on plans twice, but continued to text me all the time. I thought nothing strange of it yet. Then I started getting texts from him at all hours of the night. Whenever I called, he would reply with a text. It just started to give me a weird vibe. At worst I thought maybe he was an unstable drug addict, so I gradually stopped chatting him as much. After all, there were other guys more able and willing to take me out, which is what I had signed up for. He caught on that he was losing my interest and asked rather boldly if I had met someone else. Not wanting to lead him on, I confirmed that I was playing the field and that I did not feel a connection with him anymore. With that sociopath, my approach wouldn't have mattered. He would have turned on me regardless. He called me a slut, said I was giving my time to the wrong guys, and accused me of only dating pretty boys. That was my aha moment. All his pictures on POF were of a really decent-looking guy who dressed well and clearly styled his hair. A pretty boy, yeah? I had been so quick to try to get out on the town that I had never asked for a Skype date or a picture for my contacts. Dave was catfishing me. I ignored his tantrum, because you can't really defend yourself against people like Dave. I stopped talking to him for good that day, but he wasn't done with me. Every day he would text me as though we were still conversing normally. All one-sided things about new books he was reading or restaurants he was trying. After I realized he was not going to quit whatever you call this, I added his number to block list and thought that would be the end of it. Nope. Asterisk a few months later, I start getting texts from a new number. Hey, just junk, how are you? What's new? Are you still single? Assuming this was a guy I may have ghosted off POF, a service I was no longer using, I tried to do the decent thing and reply. I said I wasn't really dating at the moment and apologized if I had been rude or unclear about my intention. No, it's Dave. It was pretty clear you don't want to talk to me anymore, so I'm texting you from my friend's phone. I just have a few things to get off my chest. I need closure, please. JRR. Fine, let this guy have his piece. He went on to admit he was not the guy in the pictures. Duh. He requested a do-over, as friends. No. Why not? I humor him with a well-thought and empathetic but decisive explanation. He lashes out again, says I'm heartless and don't understand his plight. Ignore. Over the day or so he continues texting me, apologizing for his behavior, then lashing out again when he doesn't get a reply from me. Eventually, he succumbs and ends with some lament that we can't be friends. The texts stop for a while. Then one day, I'm driving on the freeway and my phone starts going HAM. I take a quick glance, but see that it's an unknown number. I was approaching my exit, almost at my destination, and figured it can wait. Before I got out of the car, I wanted to call my friends to touch base, see who was there or if I needed to grab us a table. But I figure the unknown number may be a friend texting from someone else's phone. So I check my texts first. Just junk. Is that you in the silver Toyota Camry *** heading west on? Yeah, it's you. You look super pretty. Are you going to? Yeah, you are. I was hoping it was a practical joke, but didn't want to take the chance. I call up the friend who lives the closest, and sure enough she's already inside. The rest of the night goes off without a hitch, but I stay the night at her place to be safe. I get brave while I'm at her place, and decide to text the number back. Who is this? Dave. Now I was pissed. I called him, but as per usual, he didn't answer. I then proceeded to barrage him with novels of texts telling him how wildly inappropriate he's being, threatened to call the cops, and demand he leave me alone. Once I had said all I could, he congratulated me for clearing the slate and proposed that be friends again. I tell him to fuck off. Then nothing. The Dave days spanned about a year. I blocked his number, his friend's number, and the new number had texted me from while essentially stalking me. He never left me notes on my car or at my home, so I truly forgot about him and never saw a need to change my number. It's now 2015, and guess who's turned up texting me again? I'm mostly a lurker on here, but have considered sharing my story several times. I was hesitant because absolutely no one knows about this, not my family nor my friends. I've held on to this for 10 years now, and figured it was time to let it out. Plus, I think there are some valuable lessons that can be learned from my experience. Here we go, caution, long story ahead. For reference, I am a 27 years old female, and this story takes place 10 years ago when I was 17. I had just started university and was excited about having a fresh, new start, since I'd always been a nerdy outcast in high school. I had never had a boyfriend before, I'd never even been on a date, so I was naive and optimistic about boys. My introverted and awkward personality hadn't magically changed since entering university, so it's safe to say that I didn't meet any interesting guys at school. One late night, I was in my room working on an assignment on my laptop when I received a request on MSN Messenger. The email address was a boy's name with some numbers. The name was clearly ethnic and likely someone of the same origin as me. Intrigued, I accepted. For the sake of the story, we'll call this boy Ken. We got to chatting, and I asked him how he had gotten my email address. He dodged the question. I let it go, not thinking too much of it. This was from a time when it was normal to accept anyone and everyone as a friend on Facebook and other social media platforms. As Ken and I continued to talk, I learned that he lived in my city and apparently wasn't much older than me. As I'd guessed, our roots were in fact in the same country. Let's call it Motherland. I asked him why he didn't have a picture of himself on his display picture, and this prompted him to suggest that we turn on our webcams because he wanted to see me too. I declined, but he insisted. Somehow, he convinced me, and we both switched our own webcams. I was pleasantly surprised and somewhat relieved to see that Ken was a good-looking, young guy, chatting to me from the comfort of his bedroom, seemingly very normal. Our MSN chats carried on for a couple of weeks. They developed into texts, and we even had a few phone calls after I had agreed to give him my phone number. I started to develop a crush on Ken. He'd asked me to go out with him a couple of times, but I was always pretty busy with school, and our schedules weren't lining up. Finally, we found one afternoon when we were both free and decided to schedule a lunch date. Ken had a car and had offered to pick me up from my university after I was done for the day. I was a little too dressed up for my C+ programming class, but just right for the lunch date we had planned at a local vegetarian restaurant. Stupidly, I didn't tell any of my friends where I was going or with whom, because I was embarrassed about going on my very first date, at almost age 18, with someone who had randomly added me on MSN. I waited outside my building when a black car with heavily tinted windows pulled up beside me. The passenger's side window rolled down, and sure enough, there was Ken, sitting in the driver's seat. I was happy to see that he was as cute in person as he was on webcam. However, what I wasn't expecting was the intense smell of weed floating out of the car. Not relevant, but part of the first impression. Admittedly, I was a bit taken aback and was concerned that he might be driving high. He unlocked the doors and motioned for me to get in, so I did without dispute. As I sat down in the passenger's seat, and he immediately put his hand on my thigh, I nervously shifted my leg away. "So," I started, "do you know where the restaurant is? I can guide you if you want." He smirked at me, but didn't say anything and just started driving. Okay, kinda weird. I thought maybe he was just nervous or awkward, both of which I could sympathize with, so I let it be. I was about to try my hand at a little small talk, which I'm no good at, when I noticed him heading towards the highway ramp. I started to worry because the restaurant was not far from my campus, and there was no reason for us to be getting on the highway. You don't need to take the highway. The restaurant is really close by. I can guide you." I tried to keep my voice steady, but I could hear my own nervousness. Ken finally spoke, for the first time since I had gotten into the car. I thought maybe we could just go to my place instead. "We can play Need for Speed, and I can make lunch for you." I was 17, on my way to the house of a guy I'd just met for the first time, and I hadn't told anyone where I was going. My mind was racing. I knew that this would be an utterly stupid thing to do. Despite the clear red flags waving in my face, I decided that I didn't want to ruin our first date by rejecting his offer to make me lunch and play NFS together, which I'd told him I liked playing. Don't judge me. So like an idiot, I reluctantly agreed to avoid being rude. We made it to his house. It was apparently his family's home and was situated in a sort of shady neighborhood. We stepped inside, and of course, no one was home except us. It was sparsely furnished and looked unkempt, which struck me as pretty odd for a family home. He informed me that his Xbox was in his bedroom. I hesitated in the doorway, but he sat at the foot of his bed in front of the TV and patted the empty space beside him for me to have a seat. There was literally nowhere else to sit in his room, so I cautiously sat down, keeping as much distance as I could between us. I started to relax as we played NFS, and he made us PB plus JS to munch on. I was about to laugh at myself for being overly paranoid when Ken did something bizarre. He got up onto the bed and sat down directly behind me, his legs on either side of me, an extremely awkward position, and tried to guide my hands on the controller. I started to ask him what he was doing, and as if this wasn't uncomfortable enough, his hands moved from the controller and slid up under my shirt. That's when I really started to panic. I thought he was going to try to grope my chest, but instead he started squeezing and massaging my belly. I was more than a little chubby back then, freshman 15, and then some. So you can imagine what that might have been like. I dropped the controller in pure shock and quickly stood up, fixing my shirt. I was at a loss for words, and he did nothing but smirk at me and tell me he liked it. I felt completely disgusted and violated. I'd had enough. I lied and told him that I had a group project to work on and needed to go. He asked where I lived so he could drop me home. Thankfully, I had the common sense to not tell him, and I asked him to drop me back to school instead, where I would be supposedly meeting my classmates. He obliged. After our very uncomfortable first date, I decided I didn't want to talk to Ken anymore. I didn't block him on MSN or on my phone, our only two methods of communication, but I rarely responded to his messages and I ignored all of his calls. Once, he messaged me on MSN, around 11 p.m., asking me to come over and telling me that he would send a cab to bring me over to his place. Thoroughly annoyed, I responded, "What do you take me for? Why do you even think I would want to do that?" He replied saying, "No sex, I promise." Just bizarre. I was disgusted and didn't even respond. He continued trying to get in touch with me for months, and then suddenly vanished. I figured he'd finally gotten the point. Now, I wish the story ended here, but it doesn't. I last heard from Ken in late February. He had stopped trying to contact me shortly after Valentine's Day. In April, 2 nuclear family members and I went on holiday to visit another relative, who we'll call N, who was living in the Caribbean at the time, and whom I loved dearly, was and still is a bit of an eccentric. She considers herself very spiritual and is an active member of a large, well-known spiritual organization. She is deeply connected with Motherland, more than the rest of us are, and goes back for frequent visits. While we stayed with her in the Caribbean, she told us about her most recent spiritual trip to Motherland, where she met a wealthy and well-connected local woman through the organization, who quickly became a very close friend. Let's call her Connie, the con artist. During our visit, and introduced us to Connie virtually over Skype, because Connie lives in Motherland. We chatted with her a couple of times throughout our vacation, via Skype, and got to know her a little bit. Little did we know back then that Connie, who had spontaneously met halfway across the world in Motherland, would soon wreak utter havoc on our lives. Now that's a story that I'm just not, and may never be, ready to tell because of how many lives were affected and the severity of the damage that had been inflicted. What you need to know is that Connie was an outright criminal and con artist who had been targeting our family from long before and had actually met her. Their meeting was no coincidence. Not only did she manage to steal over $100,000 from our family, but she took any peace of mind or sense of security we had ever had. When we finally caught on and confronted her, she insisted that we were mistaken, but disappeared into thin air once we forced her out of our lives. You're probably wondering what on earth this has to do with my story about Ken. Well, get this. The situation with Connie lasted many months. The whole thing is kind of a blur to me now, but we first spoke to her online in April, and I remember the whole ordeal lasting well into the fall. While she normally resided in Motherland, and had invited her to visit and stay with us where we, my whole family and I, presently live. That's when things really took a turn for the worse. Some of the things I clearly remember, and are important to this story, were that 1. The whole time she was staying with us, she was trying to convince me to transfer schools to a very obscure school and program in the U.S. I don't even live in the U.S., and was actually getting very pushy about it. And 2. She had asked me if I was a virgin and told me to save myself for my husband. Disturbing, I know. During this time, I was so emotionally drained and stressed that I didn't really think of anything but the situation at hand. In fact, I had stopped socializing almost entirely and even started habitually skipping classes. I had lost contact with my high school friends, and my university friends were too new to really care, so my strange behavior and new destructive habits went unnoticed. Fast forward to one day, after Connie's final disappearance in the fall. I was at home with my dad when my cell phone rang. I looked at the caller ID, and it was a number I didn't have saved, so it was showing the contact information as whatever name the phone was registered under. My heart dropped into my stomach. My phone displayed a name. The first name was a man's name, and the last name was the same last name as Connie's. I started to panic and ran into my bedroom to answer the call. I had no idea what to expect. When I picked up the phone, I was greeted by a familiar voice. It was Ken. I honestly thought I was going to puke when I came to a sudden realization that he had been part of this whole sick plot. Of course, I don't have hard evidence to prove that he was connected to Connie, but let me explain. The timing of his appearance and reappearance into my life, the last name, a fairly unique surname, originating from the part of motherland where Connie is from, and I had never known Ken's last name until then. And the fact that he contacted me out of the blue, and I had no idea why, or how were all just too bizarre to be a mere coincidence. Of course, I freaked out at Ken when he called, and I told him that if he ever called me again, I would call the police. His response was just a weird, dry half-laugh, and then he said, "Well, okay then," in the most creepy voice you can think of, and hung up. I knew in my gut that this was their last attempt to get back in touch, and somehow slither their way back into mine/my family's lives. Thankfully, I never heard from Ken again after that day. A while after this all ended, I was having a conversation with a family member who was also closely involved in all this, about the whole ordeal, and she told me she'd sensed something extremely wrong when Connie was pushing to have me sent off to the US, to that obscure school. She had an unshakable feeling that Connie was involved in some sort of human trafficking scene, and that if I left, she would never see me again. The horrifying pieces came together for me at that time. I was just too damn naive to have seen it before. The memories flooded back to me when I heard that. How Ken had told me, "No sex, I promise," when he invited me over, and how Connie was telling me to remain a virgin. As I said, I had never told a soul about Ken, nor about the weird V-card conversation with Connie. I strongly and firmly believed that Ken had been some sort of player in Connie's game, and was just there to keep me away from guys and prevent me from having a boyfriend. For those who may be wondering, we never called the police on Connie or Ken because nothing illegal happened at face value. It's very hard to explain. I'll also mention that I tried to find Ken online many times after this all ended. I don't know why. I felt like I wanted to expose him or call him out, and was not able to find even a sliver of information on him. Not by the name Ken nor by the name on the caller ID. It was as if he didn't even exist. Also, I am awful at directions and didn't remember his address or where his house was exactly. I'm sorry if this story is convoluted or confusing. I am trying to get my point across without giving out any names or too many details, which makes it a little challenging. I hope this can serve as a warning to young people to never trust anyone, to do your thorough checks on people, especially those you meet online, and to be very aware and wary of people's intentions. Also, from this incident onward, I can't stomach a lot of these spiritual organizations. I never liked the idea of them to begin with, but now I've truly experienced how they can attract both vulnerable people and also unsavory characters who are looking for someone vulnerable to prey on. No judgment for those who are into that sort of thing. It's just definitely not for me. I would like to hear what you guys think about this. Do you think my suspicions are plausible? What do you make of this? Met a guy online, talked for a day or two, but I was at the tail end of my degree and things were getting to be a lot, so I decided no dating until I was done. I let the handful of guys that seemed nice know before deleting the dating app, so they would know why I deleted it and wouldn't think I ghosted because of them. He happened to be online when I sent it and said I seemed cool. Can we keep in touch? Sure, no worries, add him on FB. Maybe once a week he's like, "Hey, how are you? What are you up to?" Normal conversation stuff. I chat about uni, work, gym, whatever. After maybe 2 to 3 months, he's like, "Hey, we've been chatting for a bit, let's grab coffee." I'm like, "Yeah, sure, he seems nice enough." I reiterated it would be as friends, and that was fine with him. I was about to head into exams, so we made plans for in 3 weeks' time after I finished exams. He started messaging more and more regularly after making plans, more than once a day, and starts calling it a date, which people call catching up a coffee date without it meaning an actual date. But I wanted to make sure we were still on the same page. So I just said, "Hey, you keep calling it a date, just making sure we are clear it's just a catch up as friends." He snapped, was sending me all sorts of horrible things on FB. So I block him. I gave him my number when we made plans though, so he started calling and calling, leaving voicemails. It was late, so I put my phone on silent and went to sleep. Next morning I wake up to 37 missed calls and voicemails between 10 p.m. continuing until 4 a.m., as well as a multitude of horrible texts. Now this was 7 years ago, when you couldn't just block someone on a phone. At first I thought if I ignored him he would get bored. After about a week, he wasn't slowing down, with dozens of calls a day. I called my phone company to have him blocked. They said you can only block 3 people. Are you sure? I had to jump through all the hoops, and then they turned around and said they can't do it. I have to call the police. So I call the police, and they say I have to call the phone company, but I can make a statement of harassment in case he does something more. 3 weeks later he's still going strong, but in his texts he starts saying he's going to force me to go on a date with him. I won't have a choice, blah blah. Then he starts saying that if I won't come to him, he will come to me, and is telling me my schedule with where I will be at any given time, which he put together based on our weekly conversations about normal stuff, threatening to come to where I will be. I have to stop doing my regular activities and pretty much become a hermit. He ended up making a threat to my life. I can't remember what he said word for word, but it was essentially girls like you get what they deserve or something like that, but more clearly threatening he would be the one to make it happen. I contacted the police again, and that was enough for an RVO, and I never heard from him again. Oh, and I was 20, but his pictures looked younger, so I didn't realize online, but it turned out this guy was 34. So this wasn't dumb young kid behavior, this was a grown-ass man. I've had many other psychos since this guy, but I am very grateful phones have since allowed you to block anyone, anytime. I grew up in a small town in Alabama. A little bit after I graduated high school, when I was 18 I started dating this guy in his early 20s from a nearby city. He was a very handsome, tall, muscular male that we'll call Sean for this story. He told me on our first date that he used to be a part of a very well-known gang in the United States. Sean explained that he'd only been a part of this gang in his younger years because he'd grown up in a bad area and hadn't really had any other options. He also did have proof of being in said gang, including being aware of gang signs associated with said gang and having tattoos associated with that gang, which I did Google to see if the tattoos and gang signs were in fact associated with said gang, since I know there are some people who like to lie about being ex-gang members and the like for some reason to seem cool. Sean didn't seem like the type to lie about that also. I gave Sean the benefit of the doubt because he didn't really give me any bad vibes. I remember he was always a gentleman to me and treated me very well. So of course, I didn't really suspect anything about him. We dated for a few weeks before the night that I found out the truth about him. I was staying over at Sean's apartment one night, and everything was seeming pretty normal. This was the first time I'd ever stayed the night at his apartment, since I do tend to be a bit cautious. So regardless of his background, it wouldn't have mattered. I just don't really like staying over at people's homes until I get to know them a bit more, and I do have an at least 3-date rule. I'd been too busy before that to really stay over at his place. So that night when I was staying over, Sean's best friend was visiting for a bit, and that's when the red flags started to show up. It did seem weird to have a friend over when the girl you are seeing is staying over for the first time. And it was revealed to me in private that Sean's friend was another ex-gang member from a well-known gang that is the enemy to the gang Sean had been a part of. Of course, I can accept people all have their backstories, but it was definitely just a weird thing to suddenly tell me out of the blue. Additionally, Sean had not even told me his friend would be at the apartment that day in the first place. An additional note, Sean's friend did corroborate that he and Sean were both ex-gang members. Then after Sean's friend had left, we were hanging out in his room, and this guy had a literal arsenal in his room. I'm not exaggerating when I say he had enough weaponry to arm a small militia. This included things like grenades, bulletproof vests, and an AK-47, or a gun similar to it, to name a few of the weapons he had in his room. Needless to say, that was the second red flag of the day. That night we were in bed together, and I can't remember what led into him revealing to me what he said in our conversation. He confessed to me that he was in fact still a part of the gang. He had told me he had said he was out of now. So of course, I was immediately giving him this look like, I'm sorry, what? Then he proceeded to go on and tell me that he actually was a hit man for the gang, and while he hadn't been active as a hit man as of late, he would still accept hits if they were given to him. The entire time he said this, he just looked me dead in the eyes with the most deadpan casual look, no feeling in his eyes, and spoke like he was talking about the weather. It was extremely creepy, and I knew right then that this guy was a straight-up sociopath. I don't doubt that he was lying. I've met people who try to get clout by lying about things like this, and he was definitely not one of those types. I did stay the rest of the night, and then left the next morning, and never talked to him again. I was definitely not going to keep on dating someone like that. There's not really anything to the story after that. He never really tried to contact me after that. I'm sure some people will probably wonder why I didn't just leave right after he told me he was a hit man. I didn't think it was a good idea to react strongly and immediately storm out of the apartment. I also didn't actually feel like he was a danger to me personally, but he definitely had the vibe of someone who had killed people. The reason why I recognize that kind of vibe is another story. He was always very polite to me, but regardless, there was no way I was going to keep dating him, no matter how hot he was. This happened to me my freshman year of college. Tinder was new, and everyone at my university was on the app. I joined to see what all of the fuss was about. Looking through profiles, I found a few guys that were really interesting, and this one guy in particular caught my eye. We will call him Walter. I swiped right on Walter, and we matched. I was excited and kinda giddy because he was super attractive. He messages me, and I got butterflies in my stomach. We message on the app for maybe an hour. Typical conversation is happening. I asked his what he did for a living. He asked what my major was. Harmless conversation. After a while he asked for my number, so we could text instead of message on this app. I gave it to him, he seemed nice enough. We messaged back and forth for a few days. Lots of flirty conversation, and plans to hang out finally occurred. By the fourth day of conversation, he started calling me babe, which gave me mixed feelings. It was cute, but also a little weird. We didn't really know each other, and had never met. I ignored it and continued on with the conversation. He started saying he wanted to be exclusive, and he really wanted to see me in person. He was begging me at this point to come to his apartment to cuddle and watch movies with him and his dog. I told him that our first meet needed to be in public. I would not be going to some stranger's apartment. He said I was overreacting and kept begging. I ignored him for the rest of the night. The next day he apologized and said he understood we needed to meet in public. So we made plans that weekend. The weekend came faster than I expected, and it was the day we were supposed to meet. Something just felt off, and I decided to back out. I texted him apologizing, saying my mom wasn't feeling well and needed me to come home to help her with some house chores. This made him annoyed, and he said, "Your mom is a big girl. If she needs you, she can call you. Just come over, and you can leave whenever to go help her. I really want to see and kiss you." I told him no, that I would be staying with my mom that weekend, and that was that. I only lived about 30 minutes from home, so I actually did go home to see my mom that day. After what he said about my mom, I started ignoring him, and the texts started rolling in. Text after text, "Babe, I'm sorry. Please come over. Babe, I miss you. Are you going to come over?" I planned on replying the next day that I was just busy with my mom. Then he started calling me. I had a total of 45 missed phone calls within a 2-hour period. He left voicemails saying he was sorry, and he just missed me and wanted me to call him back. Similar voicemails continued almost the entire time I was home. My roommate texted me shortly after I finished dinner with my mom and asked if we could go out that night. I agreed and went back to my university dorm. Suddenly the calls from Walter started to increase again. More texts, voicemails, and he started messaging me again on Tinder, asking why I wasn't replying to him. I wasn't planning on replying until I got a message on Instagram that said, "Why didn't you tell me you were coming back to town tonight?" Getting this message really freaked me out. I replied to him and said, "Sorry, I've been busy with my mom." "How did you know I was back in town?" He said, "Well, I checked your Tinder, of course. Tinder doesn't tell exact locations, but has a within 1 mile message." This really freaked me out, and I messaged him back and said that he was being really creepy. He seriously had to be constantly refreshing my profile to see the distance change. The messages, calls, and voicemails continued. All were him now apologizing for making me feel weird about him knowing where I was. He was just worried about me. We had been texting for less than a full week. Less than a full week. I told my roommate about it, and so we decided to stay in that night. The last straw for me was getting a message saying, "Look, I'm really sorry. I'm outside your dorm with flowers and chocolates. Please forgive me, oh hell no." I called campus security and told them about this guy, and they never found anyone waiting outside any of the doors. I'm assuming he was in his car waiting for me to reply. I blocked him on all socials, phone number, deleted Tinder, and have never been back on since. I have seen him once out and about in the town, but he never recognized me, thankfully. Walter, if you ever read this, I'm glad we never met. Thanks for making me second guess every single guy I find attractive. I know it is a typical way to start or end a story like that, but I would definitely behave differently now and dealt with the situation better. It happened over a year ago, and I was in a bad place in my life, struggling with social anxiety, so I wasn't able to defend myself properly. I was just leaving a grocery store as I realized I haven't locked my purse. So I stopped in the middle of stairs leading to the shop door to fix that. Suddenly I felt someone's presence behind my back. I guess I heard someone breathing. Without really looking at the pre-sun, I apologized, in a joking, silly me manner, for standing right in the middle of the stairs and blocking everyone. I walked off the stairs. The person behind me turned out to have a man's voice and said it's okay, because it's always nice to stand behind such a young, curvy woman, and probably this is his fault because he couldn't stop staring at my booty. As I turned around to communicate that I don't like such compliments unless it's a third date, I noticed the man is quite old, probably in 70s, maybe his late 60s. So I decided I should just ignore him. There is no point in arguing with an old man. I was a volunteer at a nursing home, and as much as I like old people, I know how strange and difficult they can be. So I ignored him, but he decided to place himself right in front of me and started talking to me. He said he is going to buy some smuggled Russian cigarettes, cheaper because you're not paying any excise tax, and that once upon a time he had a lover just as meaty as me and so on. I said it's all very interesting and have a nice day, but I am going home. As I was leaving the conversation, he ran his hand down my back, really gently, almost undetectably. Of course I wasn't okay with that, but I was already leaving, so I foolishly decided to ignore it just the way I ignored his compliments. Simply going back home would mean I would have to go the same direction he did, and inevitably showing him where I live. I went the opposite direction, and took longer way home, making sure he is not following me. I wasn't scared of him at that point. It was just like avoiding a conversation with someone you don't like. So I took that longer route. Guess who I met there? Yup, overly friendly old man. He was standing at the other side of a road waving his hand. It was probably accidental encounter. At some point, he must have just taken a turn into the same narrow streets of the residential area where my way back home was. I ignored that, but he crossed the road and started his jubber jabber. He said that this is the place he buys Russian cigarettes, and asked do I live alone, and where do I live. I wasn't as friendly as during the previous conversation, letting him know I don't want to talk, and I wasn't answering questions, just thinking how to get rid of him. He said that if I live somewhere there he can visit me sometime, and we can, spend time on nice activities. What? Really? He didn't give me any time to decline his courteous offer. He grabbed my boob. He literally took it in his hand and squeezed. I was so shocked I said nothing. I just took his hand off me and tried to go. But he pushed me on the fence and started to touch me, trying to kiss me on the lips. He was quite strong for an old man. Interesting thing is he wasn't in fact aggressive. He behaved as if he had no idea that I don't want this to happen. I started pushing him back and saying "no" repeatedly. I finally pushed him, and we both noticed we are not alone on the street anymore, as there were some women walking, probably yet too far to see what happened. He didn't try to grab me again. As I was quickly walking away, he called out behind me, as if nothing had happened, as if we were good friends, that Lee lives here, and almost certainly will meet again, and it will be nice to meet me. We never did. So creepy clingy grandpa, let's not meet. During my freshman and sophomore years of college, I was extremely awkward. I had just come out as gay, I didn't have any friends, and I was just generally kind of a big wad of social anxiety. Given that I didn't even have the social skills to make a few friends, it's not surprising that I also had literally no dating experience. Miraculously, over the course of the summer after sophomore year, I just sort of grew out of the worst of my awkwardness. I lost some weight, had a lot more confidence in myself, and my self-esteem was a lot higher. I came back to school in August, and by October, I had a decent number of genuine friends and had gotten a lot more involved on campus. With my newfound confidence, I decided I'd finally download Grindr and see what it was like. For anyone who doesn't know, Grindr is a gay dating app that is primarily used for finding sex and hookups. Despite my recent improvement in the social arena, I was still extremely naive and inexperienced when it came to dating and sex. I set up my Grindr profile with a nice picture of myself and a very brief bio, and I got a lot of messages very quickly after my picture got approved. One guy who messaged me had a display name of Dad for Young, which should have been my first red flag, but I was oblivious. I should note that I look really young for my age. At the time, I was 21, but I was regularly asked by campus staff which middle or high school I was visiting from. I'm 23 now, and I still get asked if I want a kid's menu if I go to a restaurant with my parents. It's bad. So Dad for Young sends me a message that just says, "What's up?" and I reply without looking at his profile first. I then look at his profile and notice he's 54. His only profile text says, "The younger the better," and his only picture was a zoomed in blurry picture of a hairy chest, so I was very much not interested. But given my inexperience, I thought ignoring him would be horribly rude, so I kept responding. I don't totally remember what we talked about in the maybe 10 or so messages we exchanged at first, but I do remember him saying I was very cute I know I told him I was a student, but I never mentioned which college I went to. It's important to note that I went to college in a major city, and there's a bunch of different colleges, all within like 5 miles of each other, and a few more within 10 miles of those. Sort of like Tinder, Grindr works based off of your location, but much more precisely. If you're less than a mile or two away from someone who is online, it will display the distance in feet. I noticed that Dad 4 Young's profile said he was 25 miles away, which I thought was kinda far. Dad 4 Young started getting more sexual in his chats, and asked if I wanted to meet up. I felt bad flat out denying him since he had been polite, so I told him I didn't want to meet up with him that day, but that we could keep chatting if he wanted. I figured that was that, and when I checked 20 minutes later, it said he was offline. Nope. About 30 minutes after that, I get another message from him. Hey, my name. I got a wild hair and thought I'd take a nice drive out to my college. Smiley face. I had not told him the name of my college, nor had I told him what part of town I was in. I looked at his profile, and it now said he was 3 miles away. I started freaking out a little, and didn't reply to his message in hopes that he'd just leave me alone. It's important to note that my college had a couple of different campus chunks separated by a few miles. I lived on the upperclassmen residential campus, which was about 2 miles from the main campus where all of the other student dorms and main buildings are. I felt like if he was going to try to find me, he'd go to the main campus first, then maybe give up since not many outside people know about the separate residential campus. 5 or 6 minutes later, I get another message that says something like, "No fun if you don't play along. What building on? Residential campus name. Are you in?" His profile now says he's a little over 2,500 feet away, and every time I reopened his profile, the distance would decrease. I was fully losing my shit at this point since this guy had the ability to pinpoint my location, so I shut my blinds, turned off my light, and locked my window, the door to the apartment, and my bedroom door. My roommate was also out of town on some kind of retreat, so it was just me. He kept sending me messages every minute or so saying things like "gonna find you," "here I come," smiley face, and other supremely creepy shit like that. The distance was down to 310 feet, and I was completely losing my mind and didn't know what to do, so I just deleted my whole profile. Nothing else happened that night, though I was absolutely terrified he was going to come knocking on my door. Fast forward to 3 days later. I decide to re-download Grindr after doing more research and seeing that I can adjust the settings so that my exact location is not visible. When I logged on the first time with my remade profile, I adjusted some of the search filters until the results were specific enough to display Dad 4 Young's profile, which I promptly blocked. Later that evening, I get a message from someone with the display name Wolfindio with the same gross profile picture as Dad 4 Young, and my stomach sinks. He sent a flurry of messages. "You F up. Almost got police called on me 'cause of you. Couldn't find you, so I had to go to other dorms and find someone else. Said I was outside his dorm and told me to leave and he'd call the cops. I am coming for you." Freaked out, blocked him again, deleted my profile again, then deleted Grindr. I refused to re-download it or any dating apps for about a year after that, at which point I worked up the courage to try again, and have not heard from this nut job since, thank God. So, terrifying old man with a fetish for young inexperienced guys, please, let's not ever meet. Recently separated male, 38, moved back to India and got on Bumble dating app. Married for 9 years, was very rusty as far as dating rituals go. Matched with Priya, female 38. We chatted for a bit. We'd both lived in similar parts of Europe at different times in our lives. We also seemed to have a lot in common. Phone chats before we met. She would talk to me for about 4 to 5 hours a day, with very intricate and disturbing details of what happened in her marriage that did not last long, to various abusive ex-suitors/boyfriends along the way. TW, SA. Alcoholism, date rape, non-consensual sex. This was all even before we met. First date in real life. The first date, where we met in real life, went spectacularly well. She came and stayed over with me, at a swanky place that I had booked. We stayed there for 2 days, seemed to have natural ease in occupying each other's spaces. Every midnight the phone, landline of the hotel room, would ring. The third day, I head back to my city, which is only 80 miles from hers. She calls me over the phone wanting to know how far the bus ride to my house was, and casually says, "I love you." I was taken aback, didn't think much of it at that time. This was followed by "in days to come. I want to be married to you. I am yours and forever." Second date in real life. I again head back to her city a week later. Booked a rather basic place, very close to her place. At 1 a.m. she gets a coffee craving. I call the room service to order in, thinking that's what she wants. No, let's walk to this 24-hour coffee shop a mile away. So yeah, the neighborhood, although fairly upscale, had loads of feral stray dogs on the streets, and many drunken men would come our way, pretending to be lost and asking for directions. She seemed to be enjoying it a lot. We have coffee at about 1:30 a.m. in the night. She again wants to walk back. She takes me to a corner of the road and says TW. SA, this is where a date didn't go well, and I was once groped. My legs were shaking at this point. We start walking further. We pass by a broken clay sculpture. She goes, I have a strong suspicion that this broken sculpture is possessed. I know all about it. My ex-husband's sisters were into witchcraft. We are back at the hotel. It's about 2:30 a.m. We go to sleep. The phone, landline of the hotel room, rings incessantly. Next morning she calls a cab, goes back to her place. I don't think I am ready for a loving relationship yet. I get this text. I head back to my city. I think about this incident a lot sometimes. It just refuses to leave me. I have disturbing fevered dreams about my incidents that she's narrated to me. I am unable to go on dates anymore. It's been 2 months since this happened. Hope I'll recover soon.